And welcome to Auto Shenanigans. How the devil are you? Have you had a good week? My name is John. Thank you very much for joining me for another exciting episode of Secrets of the Motorway. In today's episode, we're looking at the M77 motorway, which by coincidence opened in 1977, but more on that in a moment. It's not particularly long, at around 18 miles, and it runs from the big city of Glasgow down to the not very big village of Fenwick. Despite opening in 1977, the bulk of the M77 motorway wouldn't open until much later in the mid-90s. Originally, it was opened and built as a spur motorway that ran from a roundabout at Dunbreg Road up to the M8, and it stayed that way for 20 years before the M77 was extended to the south in 1996. According to one source, which is probably not that reliable, there was a slip road constructed connecting the M77 down to Gowper Street, and whilst it certainly looks possible, I can't find anything to confirm its existence. In any case, whilst the slip road was built, according to the same source, it was never actually used, and today it seems to have vanished altogether. As I mentioned, originally at Junction 1 you'd have found a roundabout and the terminus of the M77 spur, but in the 90s it was extended to the south down to Junction 5. Interestingly, like a lot of motorways, the plan for the M77 was devised in the 1960s, and the 90s extension followed the route of this decades-old plan with only a few changes made to the junction designs. That's a novel idea that we haven't seen before on the series, isn't it? Coming up with the plan and then following it through to completion, even if it was 30 years later. Good work! So after Junction 1, we begin our journey along a mid-90s motorway, and for the most part this section was built into a cutting with trees running along either side. This was done to minimise the impact on the nearby residential areas. I assume impact means noise and pollution. As a result of the cutting in the trees, though, you don't really see a lot from the motorway, and one of the things that you don't see is when the motorway passes through Pollock Country Park, and it's here that we find Pollock House, an 18th century Georgian house. There's also the Burrell Collection, a collection of around 9,000 artefacts collected from around the world, and all put into a collection. The name Burrell comes from Sir William Burrell, a Glasgow-born shipping merchant. As a result of some clever investing, I don't know, crypto or something, he amassed a small fortune which he then spent on travelling the world, collecting all of these rare artefacts and antiques. It turns out Sir William was a bloody good bloke who believed in free education. He donated his entire collection in 1944 to the city of Glasgow. It's now all on display here at Pollock Country Park. Junction 2 is an interesting one where we find the slip roads some distance apart from one another, and of course there's a story behind it. When it was first built, Junction 2 looked a bit like this. Then following redevelopment of the area and the creation of a large retail park and new housing estate, the junction was modified to look a bit like this. The looped and south-facing slip roads were removed, with new slip roads being built in their place slightly to the south. And the new slip roads link up with a road and roundabout that was constructed as part of the retail park. If you have a look at some historical satellite images of the area, you might spot this rather impressive structure that's now a housing estate. It used to be home to the Cowglen National Savings Bank, which opened here in 1966. During its peak, they employed around 6,000 people, and the buildings were described as like a mini village with its own hairdressers, nursery and staff living areas. The building was demolished in 2015 to make way for the housing estate, and you'll notice around the housing estate the street names hint towards the site's previous use. Amongst others, you'll find Penny Crescent, Investment Drive and Premium Crescent. Junction 3 remains unchanged since its construction and offers us an insight as to how Junction 2 used to be laid out because they're very similar. Whilst the junction has remained unchanged, the same can't be said for the surrounding area, and this large space that we see in the early 2000s has now been filled with housing estates. A short distance up from Junction 3 and the motorway passes underneath a bridge that doesn't really seem to go anywhere. It was constructed to retain the access to Patterton Farm, which sits alongside the M77. The farm was abandoned in the mid-2000s, although I'm not exactly sure why. I have a feeling it might be something to do with the vast redevelopment of the nearby Patterton village. Back then, there wasn't really a lot going on around Patterton, but fast forward to today and there's a load of new buildings and new houses popping up everywhere. My assumption is that the farm was commandeered by the local council for redevelopment at a later stage, but like I say, I'm not really sure. To support all of these new houses and increase in traffic levels, Junction 4 has been vastly upgraded. Oh, hang on a minute, no, my mistake. Junction 4 has been left as per its original design, having seen no upgrade work whatsoever. So it's just a set of slip roads that allow access to the M77 in certain directions only. The limited access at Junction 4 might be because just up the road at Junction 5 until 2005 is where the M77 came to an end. Actually, to be precise, the motorway terminated a little bit up from where today's Junction 5 is, where the A77 crosses over the motorway, and it's here that we find an abandoned slip road that's no longer in use today. If it were, it would offer the southbound connection to the motorway that Junction 4 is missing. The thing is, back then, using this slip road wouldn't have led you onto the M77 because it ended here, and instead you'd have picked up the A77. The A77 from this point onwards was a very dangerous road that saw a high number of accidents, and the road's age wasn't helping things either. The solution was to extend the M77 along a completely new alignment to take the bulk of the traffic and hopefully make things a little bit safer. So by 2005, junctions 5 to junctions 8 of the M77 was opened. Between junctions 5 and 6, we find a section of abandoned road that came about as a result of the M77's construction. If we take a look at an old map, we can see how the road used to be laid out before the motorway came along and severed its connection. There's another section of abandoned road to be found just up by junction 7. Before the M77 came along, this would have been a link road from the A77 into Fenwick village. Speaking of junction 7, it's a little bit odd in as much as it seems to be spread out over a short distance. I suppose in this part of the world, massive free-flowing interchanges aren't really necessary, so small, well-fitted junctions seem to be order of the day. And it's very much the same story at junction A, where we find a pair of short slip roads that make up the junction. And it's odd, because the slip roads at the junction only allow you to exit the motorway, not join it. Junction 8 is where we find the end of the M77, and I guess the slip road arrangement really does reflect that. Just up the road from the end of the M77 is this, the Spirit of Scotland monument. It's made of steel and it stands at around 5 metres tall. It was installed in 2004 and its location is near to the Battle of Loudon Hill, a battle over, freedom or something. Loudon Hill is interesting because it's a volcanic plug. It's the hill here, by the way. That's why it's framed like this, you see, so we get everything in. Anyway. This is where a volcano's vent has become filled with magma that has hardened over time, quite literally plugging the volcano. It's not the only example of a volcanic plug to be found in Scotland. There are several, and one of the more well-known ones is found in Edinburgh, upon which Edinburgh Castle sits. And there we are then, guys. That's all we've got time for this week. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there's a button specifically for that. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. That'll be wicked, sweet, awesome. And enjoy the rest of your week, whatever it is you get up to. My name is John. You've been watching Auto Shenanigans, and I'll see you next time for another exciting episode of Secrets of the Motorway. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.